This podcast is brought to you by the American Enterprise Institute.
If you like what you hear, please subscribe, rate, review, and share.
Thanks for listening. Here's our show.
What in the hell's going on?
What the hell is going on?
What the hell is going on?
I don't know what the hell he's talking about.
You don't have to know what the hell is on it.
What the hell's the matter with these guys?
We don't know what's going on.
What the hell's going on?
Who in God's name knows what it's all about?
Hi, I'm Danielle Pletka.
Now, Mark Thiessen.
Welcome to our podcast, What the Hell is Going On? Mark, what the hell now?
What the hell is going on?
I need to be more chipper here.
Well, what the hell is going on is we've got two new entrants into the Republican primary officially. We got Senator Tim Scott, who announced his candidacy last week, and Ron DeSantis, the governor of Florida, also throwing his hat in the ring. There's a pretty decent-sized field shaping up in the Republican Party. Not thankfully as big as it was in 2016, where you had like 19 people on the stage and having to have 2 tiers of debates and all the mess that was. It's a pretty strong field. I think people have been sort of self-disciplined. Mike Pompeo decided not to run. Youngkin decided not to run, though there's some rumblings he may change his mind.
Yeah,
I think he's
so.
sort of preparing himself for if everybody else stumbles and there's an opening for somebody to swoop in November, then he might jump in. But it's been sort of a semi-disciplined, it shows that people aren't afraid of Trump in terms of getting in. So that's a sign, but it's also not so big that it's unmanageable. What do you think, Danny? Could a challenger emerge to challenge Donald J. Trump?
So, I'm trying not to let, my hope triumph over my experience. No, I think, Trump is setting aside everything that we've iterated and reiterated a million times on this podcast and elsewhere, he's a formidable candidate because he really, and I said this before January 6th happened with perhaps a little bit more admiration than I do now, which is that he just has a feral marketing sense. He really does. I think he's lost some of that. I don't think that he's quite, the pitch man that he was, because he's become so self-obsessed, because I think that he is isolated from a lot of normal people. And again, not necessarily normal voters, but in terms of the people he has around him for his campaign, in terms of the people he has around him for his advisors, he has peeled back the onion so many times, alienated so many people that he's really down to the last few who he has around him, and that's never a good thing for any person. So, but that being said, he's pretty formidable.
When we had him on the podcast, you said he was quite charming. You said that if he showed that side of himself to voters more often, he probably would have won the election.
But he can't. Remember, that's his problem, isn't it? That he was well brought up enough that when he's one-on-one with somebody, he behaves decently. But damn, from boinking models while his wife was pregnant to, no, you know what? I'm sorry. All of those things are factors. He's kind of a pig. Yeah. And that's the problem.
I'm not going there. Look,
you're more delicate than I am.
I just think that's not an issue for Republican voters. That's not going to. No one cares about that.
Nobody cares about Stormy Daniels. No, you're right. All right, let's
taught
cut
us
that.
Bill Clinton taught us that, as Nancy Pelosi, the personal stuff doesn't matter, and Republicans took that to heart and decided to look past him.
I miss those days when Gary Hart got out of the race. Gary Hart, a single man, got out of the race because he was running around with some floozy.
I also miss the Democratic Party of the era of big government is over, and and work requirements for welfare and all the other things that Bill Clinton.
Yes,
gave us.
We never thought we would miss Bill Clinton. So anyway, but you asked me a question. I do think that Donald Trump is one horrible gaffe, one more meeting with Kanye West, one more, philo-Nazi coming and visiting with him away from a potential disaster.
Or that could happen. And
again,
not a
the voice of hope speaking over the voice of experience. But, he is also looking at some actual serious legal trouble as well. Not the BS, E. Jean, whatever her name is, rape charges from 30 years ago, or the Stormy Daniels garbage, but some of the classified information, the election interference in Georgia, all of those things are pennies yet to drop.
That just causes Republicans to rally around him. He was in the 40s in the polls until the Alvin Bragg indictment, and that's when he sort of went into the 50s and then has stayed there.
So I thought it was pretty interesting that DeSantis floated that he might be willing to pardon Trump if he became president.
Yep, absolutely. Just for the record, I said that I think I said it on this podcast like 6 months ago that would be a smart move for him to do. Let me give you a theory of the case of how Trump might not get the nomination. So I think that his support is a mile wide and an inch deep. And if there was a CBS News poll, and this is what I see the breakdown of the Republican
You wrote
electorate.
a piece about this,
I did.
right?
I did
Yeah.
mention this in my column. That basically 24% of Republicans are what I would call hard MAGA. Only Trump. They're only going to vote for Trump in the primary, and that's the only person they're considering. 27% are not MAGA, not Trump. They won't vote for Trump under any circumstance.
And these are Republicans.
These are
right?
This is the Republican electorate. And then 49% say they're choosing between Trump and other candidates. So what that says to me is, so I call those soft MAGA, right? So you've got these three groups of Republicans. The majority are in the soft MAGA category. They're not never Trumpers, but they're not Trumpers, 100%. And they're trying to decide. What that says to me is that 76% of the Republican electorate is up for grabs, or at least a significant portion of that is. And if somebody can emerge to consolidate the 27% who don't want Trump with enough of those people and persuade enough of those people who are soft MAGA in the middle to come around, then he can be beaten. If that 76% is divided up among 4, 5, 6 candidates, then it's going to be 2016 all over again.
Yeah, but I do think that there's another factor here. That poll, was that voters? Was that registered voters, likely voters, or just randos? I mean, that's the problem.
Yeah.
Because, again,
Yeah.
you've got your most, and this is a problem for the Democrats as well, obviously, you've got your most motivated people who turn out for primaries.
Sure.
The system elevates the fringe. It always has. So all of this, of course, is bearing the lead that I actually wanted to talk about, which was not DeSantis's less than stellar appearance to announce his campaign. I want to talk a little bit about something that Tim Scott raised, not again because Tim Scott raised it as an issue, but because he tells us something interesting about the Republican Party, which is that the Republican Party is actually increasingly the more diverse party. The Republican Party is actually, fascinatingly, a party that has evened up numbers, has grown its base with black voters and with Latinos. There are a couple numbers that just really gobsmacked me that our guest talked about. What's happening in the party. No news to anybody that the Republicans are becoming more working class. We've seen that, and more multiracial. Dems are becoming more elite and more white. The Democrats are tied with Republicans among Hispanics right now. I mean, for me, that is something staggering. In the 2018 midterms, Dems held, wait for this number, a 47% lead among Hispanics, and now they're tied up. The only area where Democrats really are not just holding their lead, but really increasing it is with women with college degrees, white women with college degrees. They are losing ground with everybody else. Now, as a white woman with a college degree who doesn't vote Democratic, I don't know what's wrong with the rest of you, but but that is extraordinarily interesting. And if we weren't spending all of our time talking about the fact that, there was a Twitter meltdown for DeSantis, or that Donald Trump is just the thing that sucks all the oxygen out of every conversation ever, this would be something that is hugely important.
Well, it is hugely important because it's happening and it's going to affect the elections. So I think you're absolutely right to raise it. And the other thing is that Joe Biden's approval with pretty much every group is down dramatically. I mean, he has, so just to put this in perspective, the 538 website, if you go to it, has a really great approval tracker, and you can track his approval like every day of his presidency and compare it to every other president that is in the history of polling going back to Harry Truman.
Is cool.
And so I think on day 900 or so of his presidency, which is where we reached that milestone this weekend, he's the least popular president in the history of presidential polling going back to Harry Truman, except for Jimmy Carter. He goes back and forth with Trump a little bit, depending on the day, but among all the others at this point in his presidency, and his approval with black Americans is at 60%. It was like in the 80s and 90s when he first took office. So he's vulnerable with black Americans, particularly with black working class men, which is a segment. And the thing is, Republicans aren't going to get a majority of the black vote for a long, long time, but Democrats need 85, 90% of the black vote in order to win elections. And if Republicans can even make a small inroad in that community, then that's big. And in terms of the Hispanics, this is where the demography is destiny thing has fallen apart. It's that,
Because you can't just say someone is black and therefore they're a leftist liberal, and someone is Hispanic and therefore they're a leftist liberal. I
they
don't
all
understand,
assume
Mark.
that they're for illegal immigration.
Well,
right?
it's not just
because
that. It's
because
so
they're Hispanics
racist
coming
to
over the
assume
border.
these
Of course,
things.
now it's not just Hispanics; it's Russians and
Ukrainians.
Chinese and everybody coming over the border. Everybody's figured out that if you can't get in the country, just fly to Mexico City and cross over the border. On
But
a
you
bus.
digress.
But I digress. Well, I don't digress because Hispanics who can vote are citizens. And if they are citizens, it means they came here legally and they followed the rules, and they don't like people cutting the line. Most immigrants are really anti-illegal immigration because they follow the rules.
Because they followed the
and
rules.
And these people
I
are
sure
cutting
did.
the line and sneaking into the country.
Exactly.
And so all of a sudden, Republicans being tough on the border, they thought, this is going to alienate Hispanics. No, it really doesn't. And especially the Hispanics in the border towns.
No, I know.
Who
Look,
don't like
Joe Biden is the one who said this perfectly. Joe Biden said...
He said something perfectly?
Yes, he did. He said he encapsulated the attitude of the Democratic Party when he said during the election, during the last election, he said to somebody, "If you ain't voting for me, you ain't black." And
Yeah.
it was like, what?
Because the Republicans want to put y'all in chains.
Imagine to yourself if a Republican had said such a thing. It would dominate the headlines for months. And in any case, there's a lot going on here. There's a lot of actually interesting things going on that don't involve random lawsuits against Donald Trump or Donald Trump calling people by stupid new nasty names. And DeSantis is part of that, and Tim Scott is part of that. And we are really lucky to have someone who spends a little bit more time thinking about some of these nuances and a little less time thinking about how he can write yet another headline about Donald Trump with us. I'm sure you folks will remember Josh Kraushaar, who's with us today. He is now a really cool new job, actually. This is something I've subscribed to since its very inception. He's the editor-in-chief of Jewish Insider. He's also a contributor to Axios, where he was previously, and he's also on Fox News Radio. He's just a wonderful political
and Fox
analyst.
News special report. I've been on the panel with him a lot with Brett Baer.
Is that the star panel, Mark?
It's called the All-Star Panel, Danny, which is why you're not on it.
Yes, that.
But
and
Josh
that and I have
is.
a contract with
But
NBC
but
News.
Josh,
but yes.
that's why, because Josh is on the All-Star Panel, and here's our interview. Josh, welcome back to the podcast.
Hey, Mark. Hey, Donnie. Great to be back on the show with you guys.
So great to have you. We're very lucky to have you because it was a big week last week in the Republican primary race. We had Florida Governor Ron DeSantis get in the race, and before that, Republican Senator Tim Scott announced his candidacy. Give us your assessment of what the week meant and how this will affect the upcoming primaries.
Well, one of those two Republicans who announced their candidacy had a rally, had thousands of adoring supporters, and really got a strong stump speech to be heard across the country and got their campaign off on a strong note. The other candidate is the Republican who is much more formidable as the runner, as the person who's polling in second place in the race. And he decided to use sort of a very decrepit technology in Twitter Spaces that couldn't handle, even a few 100,000 people online, and ultimately got off to a very shaky start, at least on the political front. Now, did raise a lot of money, brought in, I think, about $8 million on the campaign side in the last couple days. But look, there is sort of a disconnect here between the Republicans that are running the campaigns the right way, that are doing the basic blocking and tackling, and still that they're the underdogs. Tim Scott is the underdog. He's polling in the single digits, even in his, he's struggling, even behind in his home state of South Carolina as well. And then you have someone like DeSantis who has a lot of things going for him. Mark, you've written some great columns about his conservative governing record in Florida. He's governed with a great economy. He's fought the culture wars successfully in a way that other governors, Republicans included, haven't been able to say for themselves. And yet he seems to kind of focus on the most trivial or least significant parts of his record. And then you have this launch with Elon Musk on the middle of this past week, and it just isn't the type of campaign you would expect from a first-tier candidate like Governor DeSantis. So, look, there's plenty of time. We're in May. of 2023. There's, many, many months to go before the campaign really does heat up. But there's a lot of warning signs for the leading Trump challenger in DeSantis. And there's a lot of things to be, frankly, encouraged about with some of these new candidates, like a Senator Scott. We're going to probably hear about Vice President Pence, former Vice President Pence, jumping in the race later in the summer. So this is a very volatile field, but I think the elephant in the room still is former President Trump, who has only seen his advantage over all these other Republicans grow, and he looks like the pretty solid frontrunner at this point in the race.
Elephant in the room is a nice way to describe Donald Trump. So Mark and I got into a little bit of a handbag fight, slapping back and forth at each other about whether DeSantis's rollout was important or it wasn't. And I want to get back to that fight and continue to have it. But I want to ask you first about Tim Scott, and I'll tell you why I want to start with him, because one of these things is not like the other. When I look at the list of people who are running or the list of maybes, and no, it's not that Tim Scott is black. It is that Tim Scott is sort of the sunny, happy warrior out there. He's not taking on Trump. He's not hating on Bud Light. He's not engaging in those typical sorts of arguments. He's kind of like, this is my story. I'm a striver. I believe in America. He's at least trying to strike a Reagan-esque note. Do you think there's even room for that in American politics anymore?
Well, I think there are two parts to the question, which is, number one, what does the Republican Party even look like in 2023, 2024, right? I think there's almost a realization that a lot of folks on the campaign side are realizing, right, that you may have to basically beat Trump or if you're not going to beat Trump, you're basically going to have to be someone very similar to Trump with his populism, with his in-your-face anger and grievance peddling. There may be no room for the Marco Rubio, Tim Scott, Nikki Haley types, Mike Pence. If you look at Mike Pence's negatives, by the way, in Republican Party polling, I would have been stunned if you told me what they were, a few years ago.
What
And
are they?
Look, the numbers. The reason Pence's numbers went down in the Republican Party wasn't because of his governing record. It was because he didn't defend Donald Trump on January 6th, and he didn't break the law on January 6th. So that's the Republican Party electorate when it comes to the base, when it comes to the primary voters these days. And it may just be that no matter how strong of a campaign you have, no matter how effective of a message you have to the broader electorate, it may just be, and we've seen this in some of the Senate and congressional primaries recently, it may just be you have to be the most crazy. You have to pander to the worst elements in the party to be successful. And that may be just a bridge too far for many of these candidates. As far as Scott goes, and I do think that Scott, from a basic, politics 101, how to run a good campaign, he's done everything right so far. Forget about the ideology, but just the strategy, the tactics. The thing that DeSantis, I kind of am stunned that DeSantis, who's been so successful as a governor, gets stuck in the weeds when he's talking about abbreviations like, ESG or, even DEI, which I understand and a lot of us understand, but even a lot of Republicans don't speak in sort of the technical details of the conservative online world when they're criticizing some of the excesses with woke progressivism. Trump, for all his, challenges, he actually speaks very bluntly about a boy's a boy, a girl's a girl. Like, this is crazy stuff with what's going out in the schools. Like, that is the rhetoric that the simple, straightforward rhetoric that is successful and effective in Republican politics. Tim Scott has the classic Reagan-esque rhetoric, but it's not just the policy, it's the connecting of the biography with a conservative message and the big themes that you would do if you were elected president. It wasn't just the glitches from the Twitter event this past week. It was the fact that DeSantis seems to be talking to an audience of maybe a few hundred people that are very online that don't necessarily speak the language of, cultural Marxism and some of these phrases that, again, I understand what he's talking about, and a lot of people very immersed in this stuff do, but it's not going to reach your average Iowa caucus voter. It's not going to reach your average town hall questioner in New Hampshire, and I'm kind of stunned that with all the preparation that DeSantis had, he is not hitting his mark when it just comes to talking about his successes as governor of Florida.
Yeah, put aside the technical glitches, which I don't think he can be blamed for. They can be blamed for deciding to do this on Twitter Spaces to begin with. The idea that, first of all, I was on Special Report the next night on the All-Star panel, and, if he had had a campaign event like Tim Scott's, Brett would have taken that live. at 6 p.m.
Yeah,
and millions of people would have seen it. You know, he's not going to take a Twitter Spaces audio-only event that gets delayed for 20 minutes, you know? And then he's sitting there with Elon Musk, who's like a famous guy, talking about
rich guy,
but I mean, who is taking up as much airtime and talking about Twitter and talking about Bitcoin and all this stuff. And it's just like, you know, there's no video, there's no adoring crowd, there's no, you know, softening his image by showing him with his family and his lovely wife and his kids. It's just mindless. Now, I know he did break the internet. I mean, they had so many people tune in that they couldn't handle it, and that's probably a good thing. And, you know, I think it's had 3.3 million views since then. But, you know, it actually hasn't had any views because there's nothing to view. It's an audio thing. I mean, it's like it wasn't even Zoom. He would have been better with Zoom. At least there's a picture.
Well, the reason that you have the reason you have an announcement like that is that this is the one moment throughout almost at any other point in the campaign.
You get one chance to introduce yourself.
Right, one chance to introduce yourself internationally. Like, you know, a lot of the international networks are going to be covering your kickoff event, and you're never going to have a chance to get that type of audience ever again. And we were waiting, you know, we were kind of, when's the date? When is he going to make the big announcement? The crazy thing is that this week, DeSantis is doing a campaign kickoff in Des Moines, and he's going throughout the state of Iowa. That could have been the introduction. That could have been the kickoff, and they could have done the Twitter event, you know, the week after. And no one would have, you know, Elon Musk would still be around, I'm sure, to do that event. So, you know, I'm a little confused at some of the tactics and the decision-making within the campaign apparatus.
It's really interesting, actually, because I was talking, I can't remember to whom, but another Republican senator, actually, last year, and he said to me, you know, Tim Scott, I have really high confidence that he would make a very good president. I don't have really high confidence that he would run a good campaign. And I think so far, as you said, that's been wrong. But I want to come back to something that both you and Mark mentioned. I get the outrage factor against wokeism and DEI and ESG and all of those acronyms that we talk about in Washington. I get that. But that is not what has propelled DeSantis to success in Florida. It's not getting down and talking in the weeds. It's about big ideas about how to change things and being effective. I can't understand what the disconnect is. By the way, that wasn't his only chance to introduce himself. That was his second chance to introduce himself. He could have introduced himself after he had a landslide election.
Well, he did.
And let Donald Trump eat his lunch.
He was the first
Josh,
person
you don't even
on
need to be here. Mark and I are just going to fight with each other.
Fine.
But what are political insiders saying about all of this? Is everybody as perplexed as we are?
Well, look, I do think the culture war stuff, especially what he did in the run-up to the re-election, I thought that, you know, that was actually good stuff. I mean, that was stuff that was sellable because he wasn't talking about, you know, punishing vaccine makers. He wasn't talking about 6-week abortion bans. He wasn't talking about, you know, I've always said that DeSantis has trouble taking the W, taking the win. Like, he had some really kind of what I would call mainstream political, the silent majority of Floridians and probably Americans, I'm sure, agreed with him on some of these fights he picked with the left. But then he needed more. Like, he couldn't accept the win. He had to continue fighting with Disney over the zoning of a property in Orlando, right? He had to fight with the College Board, and I think he talked about banning the SATs, which I think got to a point where he won the fight over curriculum in this African American Studies program, and then he still needed to fight with the College Board, and he eventually lost. I think they ended up going back to some of their old plans. And look, a lot of this culture war stuff, it's kind of the seasoning to politics. You need some of it to spice things up. It doesn't just connect with the base, but it gets a lot of some of these swing voters engaged. But it can't be the whole message, and it can't be the dominant message. You've got to talk about the economy, how your economy is stronger than how people in California and people in blue states are moving to Florida because everyone wants to get jobs and have great travel and have great amenities in a state like Florida. The numbers are undeniable. Inflation is lower in Florida. I mean, that is what people care the most about. And to leave that out, to not think big picture and to focus on the weeds, it's like putting too much salt in a recipe. You need that. It's a prerequisite to being part of your message, but it can't be the only part of your message.
And
I think that's one thing that the DeSantis campaign has lost.
you just made a better sale for DeSantis than I think he made for himself when you talked about the Florida economy and you talked about all of that. That's exactly right.
Well, what's so unbelievable about it is that that's all he's been talking about. I mean, he did a book tour on the Florida model, right? The Florida blueprint. And he went to the Reagan Library in California, and his whole speech was about how for, 180 years, everybody was beating a path to California, and now they're beating a path out of California to Florida, and had all the stats and the data and everything like that. And he's been talking about that, and it's almost like he got bored with it, and so he didn't mention it in his announcement or didn't talk about it in any way. It's like if you look at the Fox News poll that just came out yesterday, I mean, the number one issue is inflation in the economy. And, he's got a great story to tell there, and he didn't focus on that. It's perplexing.
Yeah, and there was I think there was more talk, Mark, about crypto on the Twitter Spaces and the actual inflation situation. So that was a problem. It's a problem when you kind of get in those rabbit holes.
Yeah, Elon Musk blew up a SpaceX rocket, and he blew up Ron DeSantis' launch too.
Mark's been waiting to say that. I can feel it. So let's talk about the other candidates for a second, because obviously, we're talking about Trump. He's number one. Ron DeSantis, he's a solid number two. But there are other candidates. I actually felt really badly for Tim Scott when I looked at the list, because Vivek Ramaswamy is running at twice what Tim Scott is running at, which is 4%. Is this really early to be talking about the presidential? This is Mark and I were talking about before we called you. Do we just have no sense of what the landscape is really going to look like because it's June or almost June of 2023?
Wasn't Jeb exclamation point leading at this point in 2016?
I mean, it's early, guys, but as always, these campaigns move fast. And, we're going to really, frankly, going to be calling the field come December, January. Like, remember in 2020 for the Democrats, Kamala Harris didn't even make it to the Iowa caucuses. So, I think there's going to be a need to kind of streamline the field if candidates like Nikki Haley or Pence or whoever aren't getting the traction. They're almost going to be doing Trump service for him, because they're going to be splitting up some of this anti-Trump vote out there. So, look, I think it's actually useful to have more candidates, because I think we're still trying to figure out what Republican voters are looking for. And look, I could see Scott breaking through. It's early. It is early. He could air ads in Iowa. By the way, the only states that matter right now, it's not the national numbers. It's Iowa. It's New Hampshire. It's all these candidates trying to make an upset play to dethrone Trump in the first two caucuses and primaries. And if that happens, throw out these national polls, because they can change really fast. The problem, I think, is that the Iowa numbers are also looking very, very strong for Trump. There was a Emerson poll. I think it was a little favorable to Trump. They tend to be pretty hot for Trump these days. But it showed Trump with about a 60-point advantage over DeSantis, maybe a 40 to 50-point advantage head-to-head against DeSantis. Even the more optimistic anti-Trump folks that are doing polling in the state find Trump, 15 points up over DeSantis. So, look, even the early states where this race is going to be decided, Trump has a pretty formidable lead. So, look, it's early. I think there's a play if you're DeSantis, if you're Scott, if you're Nikki Haley, which is to camp out in Iowa, try to get to Trump's right on some of the social, cultural issues, but especially abortion, where DeSantis signed that 6-week abortion ban, which may hurt him in a general if he gets to the nomination. But I think it's actually a smart move in the primary to win Iowa, to win some of these conservative states. But if he doesn't win Iowa, if Trump wins Iowa, and if then he follows that up with a New Hampshire victory, the race is over. Everything is going to come down to those first two early states.
Yeah. Tell me what you think of this analysis, that it seems to me there are really two Republican primaries. There's a Republican primary to challenge Joe Biden, and there's a Republican primary to challenge Trump. And then we got to settle that one first. And so, Trump's at his, 50, 55 range. He was in the 40s until the indictment. Then the rest of it, there's a primary to emerge as the challenger. But isn't there a danger that we could have these candidates following the Ted Cruz model, which is, well, I'll just be the last guy standing and I'll challenge him at the end, which we know doesn't work, because at that point he's built up so much momentum. Don't we have to see, if these guys can't get out of the 1, 2, 3, 5, 6% range, got to get out. And by Iowa, if we have multiple candidates on the ballot in Iowa, it's over. It's Trump.
Yeah. No, and I actually am worried that, or if you're a Republican, I think you should be worried that some of these candidates may not get that message. They're already getting in later, and they're going to want more time to show that they can turn things Nikki Haley and Tim Scott and that South Carolina dynamic is going to be very interesting because it's possible one of them moves ahead of another. And you probably would think that the South Carolinian with more momentum should be the one who stays in, the one who's not raising enough money. Maybe they should get out. But, boy, I'm a little skeptical that that's going to happen because I know what happened in 2016, and I'm hearing a lot of the similar rationales from these campaigns on why they're not going to be the ones to do the dropping out, and they're going to want to take their time to see who can be the most formidable. So I am sort of skeptical that there's going to be sort of a teamwork effect. The one thing that's going to be interesting to watch, especially as we get closer to that Fox debate in August, is Chris Christie's potential entrance into this race. He's the only Republican, and I've been surprised how little Nikki Haley or DeSantis or even Tim Scott has even drawn any contrast against the front runner who you're going to have to beat to be the nominee. And that's a very 2016 thing, a very 2016 dynamic where every Republican wanted someone else to take on Trump and no one did until the very end, and then it was too late. I think Chris Christie actually I don't think maybe, I think in his heart of hearts he's not going to be the nominee, but I do think he may enter the race as someone who's going to be on the debate stage and actually will prosecute the case against Trump and maybe get some eyeballs and maybe get some points that way, at least points against Trump that way. So that's one thing to watch. But, boy, if no one's going after Trump by the time that debate rolls around, or if Trump doesn't show up at that debate and it doesn't affect his numbers, he's going to be a heavy favorite if things don't turn pretty quickly.
Ugh. All right, we've taken this in a direction that's depressing me, and I hate that. Let's take this in a direction that doesn't depress me, which is not necessarily Donald Trump's loss, but at least something good about the Republican Party. One of the things that I thought was really interesting that you highlighted is, Tim Scott, only black Republican senator, running for president. We've got a black Republican running for governor in Kentucky. In fact, the Republican Party is not the party that I think a lot of people think it is, or at least not as much as
party
people
that
thought.
The Democrats think it is, which is a white supremacist Jim Crow party.
Exactly. But Mark, of course, said it better. He's much better with this cultural stuff than I am. But
among other things.
Yeah. Don't get me started. But one of the things that you note in this piece that you wrote, and I think I would agree, is that coastal elite takeover of the Democratic Party, and you obviously didn't use those words, but I will. The coastal elite takeover of the Democratic Party has meant that on values issues, on social issues, on religious issues, actually they're out of step with a lot of people in the black community and in the Latino community as well. And I think that's something that's really worth doubling down on for a lot of Republicans. But I wonder if you can sort of dive into that a little bit, what you see.
Well, absolutely. I think it's a very important dynamic. And there was actually new data from the liberal sort of data mining group Catalyst that came out a couple weeks ago and found that when they actually examined the precinct by precinct data, that it was African-American voters that, even though they still voted solidly Democratic, they made among the most moves towards the Republican Party, especially African-American men. So it only confirms some of this anecdotal or, the growth of African-American Republican lawmakers we're seeing in Congress. And look, I think the thing with that makes it so politically important is if that trend even continues on a very small scale, that could change the dynamic in states like Michigan or, in states like Georgia. The map could look a little bit different if Republicans could get 20% of the African-American vote versus, 10 to 15%. And it's doable. I think you can look at some of the targeted races, and there's some evidence that Republicans have made small but significant inroads. And you're seeing, I think it's not a coincidence, you're seeing you have Tim Scott leading the charge on the presidential race. You also have Larry Elder, who's not going to be much of a factor, but he's also running in that field. You have Byron Donalds, the congressman from Florida, who I see on almost every cable news show these days and makes the conservative case pretty effectively much of the time. And he's becoming a more familiar face to, kind of the news junkie crowd. And you also have, you mentioned Kentucky. That's going to be the big race in 2023. It's going to be a competitive race. Governor Beshear is quite popular for a Democrat in the state of Kentucky, but all the polling suggests this is going to come down to 2 or 3 points, and it's going to be a hotly fought race with the eyes of the country on it as a possible precursor for 2024. And he's someone who is a Mitch McConnell protege who I've interviewed him a number of times. He would be a national star if he gets elected governor in the Republican Party. So, there are a lot of these data points that are growing and emerging, and a lot of people didn't. There were a lot of predictions, if you remember, back in the Romney era when Republicans had been losing ground with non-white voters, and it was sort of an inevitability that Democrats were going to win the day in the future. And it's hard to kind of predict things because the opposite of a lot of those expectations has actually happened, where Democrats have done better with these affluent white suburbanites. They've actually made surprising inroads in the last decade, and Republicans are making inroads with Hispanic, African American, and Asian Americans to a point that a lot of people didn't see coming. So, look, in a way, Democrats still hold the advantage because there may be a lot more. The suburban voters are in some pretty crucial states and districts, and that's a pretty valuable voting bloc by itself. But the racial polarization that seemed to dominate our country for so long is actually going the other direction. I think it's a good sign. It's an encouraging sign for both the Republican Party and also for our democracy.
Yeah, Democrats say the Republicans are becoming the party of the white working class. They're actually becoming the party of the working class. Isn't it? I mean, there were a lot of working class blacks and Hispanics and other minorities who they had the same things that are attracting white working class people to the Republican Party are attracting them as well.
That's right. I mean, the Democratic Party right now is sort of the party of like the really rich, the really elite, and then the very poor. It's a sort of a incoherent coalition that identity politics plays a big role. You kind of fusing that together, but that is fraying. That is changing, and I see that trend continuing at a small scale level in the coming years. And it'll be interesting to see what happens in 2024 and whether how Tim Scott does in the primary, and whether any Republican can continue to make some of the gains that have been happening since since 2016.
It strikes me, when you talk about the changing nature of the Republican Party and the changing nature of the Democratic Party as well, and the very much growing, I think, class divides in the United States as far as how people see things, it strikes me that, Joe Biden really is sort of the finger in the dike for the Democratic Party. He's the last. He is the last of those sort of, Scranton, PA. Is he even from Scranton? But still, I digress. But, he's the last of those sort of union, loving, train riding, kind of ice cream store talking kind of guys who's not out there trying to push a Green New Deal. I mean, he is, but, that's his image. There's nobody else. There's no one else. There's no one else there.
That's why he's the nominee.
Well,
he's the nominee because they literally couldn't come up with anybody else.
Because they're not stupid like Republicans, apparently. But
I was going to say that's exactly that. The reason why an 82-year-old Biden is being pushed to run for re-election is precisely because of that dynamic, which is an open primary for the Democrats in 2024 would become a very messy civil war that would be defined along identity and ideological lines. And Elizabeth Warren or Pete Buttigieg would be unable to win over any you look at their performance among non-white voters in the 2020 primaries, and then you have someone like Kamala Harris who would probably underperform with a lot of other voting groups, given her approval ratings right now, and she's the vice president of the country. So, I mean, we are in the Democrats. It's kind of like go with the devil. They know Biden's problems. They know his health is going to be a huge issue. His age is an even bigger issue. And yet they look at the other options and they look at kind of the divides within their own party and they're like, we'll take the known knowns and not the known unknowns, as Don Rumsfeld once said. Go with the known known in Biden instead of these kind of scary unknowns that could happen if Biden stepped aside.
I cannot believe that you just quoted Don Rumsfeld. Just as a little aside here, I actually snarkily said to Mark before we got on, let's see how many Rumsfeld quotes you can get in because it drives me crazy. And there you are doing his job for him.
I knew we brought the right guy on.
I love it. I am a fan of Rumsfeld's rhetoric, but that is,
that was a great line. No,
Yeah.
I think, look, I mean, we need to wrap up. We've taken so much of your time, but this really is look, I think we have not spent a lot of time because we're so caught up in fights, both petty and extraordinarily important, in the now, that we don't recognize that this is a real inflection point coming for us and that we really don't have an idea what's ahead for either the Republican or the Democratic Party. It's like standing at the edge of a cliff and kind of looking over and being a little worried.
Yeah, we're at a tipping point. This could be the last. If you have an 82-year-old and a 78-year-old, if that's what we have, I mean, it's not a great sign about where we are as a country. Like if that's not what most voters want, yet the parties are kind of so drawn to these elder statesmen. But I think a lot of in 2028,
emphasis
I don't
on
want
the
to get too
elder.
far ahead of things. Yeah, they'll be. I mean, Biden will be 86. I mean, that's hard to imagine. I mean, 86 years old at the end of a second term. But I was talking to a Republican strategist who says like if unless Ron DeSantis wins, Trump is couldn't run for more than one other term, and Biden is obviously would be termed out in 86. And you could have like J.D. Vance, Josh Hawley. You could have this kind of very as you guys know, this like Nat Con wing. They want to make their statement in Republican politics, and there could be a changing of the guard, whether it's along racial lines, whether it's along ideological lines. But there's going to be a lot of changes in both parties in the next election, and there's going to be fights within the parties that are going to get really, really messy and really could define where our politics go in the next couple decades.
I've got two quick exit questions. So one, we were talking about why Joe Biden is the nominee. The reason he's the nominee is because the Democrats saw that they were headed for electoral disaster if Bernie Sanders was the nominee, and so everybody got out of the race.
He's not that young either,
and
by
cleared.
the way.
But he's a young. He's
a young 82.
He's a young 81 or 82 or whatever he is compared to Joe Biden. But do you think there's any hope that we're going to have similar discipline? That Republicans will see Donald Trump as their Bernie Sanders, and that they got to get out of the way in order to have one person challenge him?
So I'm pessimistic. I do think when you look at the parties, the whole historical line about kind of institutions was that they still mattered and parties still decided or at least shaped these nomination contests. And, that's not the case anymore, but it's certainly not the case with the Republican Party. I mean, the Republican Party is almost trying to imitate the Democratic Party of like the 70s and the 80s, where like there was no one in charge and you had a lot of chaos going on. And that's kind of where things stand. And I don't think there's anyone that could tell even the more kind of traditional candidates to step aside. I don't think there's any institution, whether it's the RNC or any leadership structure, to tell anyone to step aside. The Democrats still, if you look at the makeup of the Democratic Party, there still is that moderate kind of traditional bloc that listens to, they're much more deferential to leadership, for better or for worse, these days. And they still have their own problems along those lines. But I don't think what happened for the Democrats in 2020 when, Biden, all he had to do was win South Carolina, and then you had Buttigieg and Klobuchar step aside right away, and they all sang Kumbaya and got together pretty soon. I think it would be a hard time to see the Republicans, like whether Trump gets the nomination or whether DeSantis gets the nomination or anyone else, for this party for Humpty Dumpty to get put back together again. It's a really challenging task, and it's really hard for anyone to control all those volatile dynamics within the GOP right now.
All right, so curveball for the final question. Joe Manchin, no labels. So, Manchin obviously is not going to be able to win his Senate race in West Virginia now that Jim Justice has gotten in. He's got no path to re-election there. So, the normal move in politics is when you're blocked at one level, apply for a bigger job.
The American way.
What do you think of the possibility of, if Trump gets the nomination, of a no-labels candidacy with Joe Manchin at the head of the ticket with a Republican vice presidential nominee? And, the third party thing has always been, it's like Ahab and the whale. It's like it never happens. But, it seems like the majority of the country doesn't want a Trump-Biden rematch, and they're getting it. They seem to be getting it anyway. And neither side has any safe harbor to defect from their candidate, right? If you're a Republican who doesn't like Trump and you look at the Democratic Party under Biden, it's like, I can't vote for that. And if you're a Democrat who's not thrilled with Joe Biden, you can't vote for Trump, obviously. Could this be a unique situation where sort of a third party that's sort of centrist, moderate, bipartisan ticket could actually pull enough votes to be competitive?
Well, I do think Manchin is seriously considering it because he doesn't have a great pathway to re-election in West Virginia, and he's already gotten a lot of attention as the pivot vote in the Senate. He could certainly get more attention as a third-party candidate, and he does like that the media oxygen. I don't think that even someone who's the most compelling third-party candidate, even with Biden and Trump, the partisanship is still so strong in this country, even with the growth of independent or people defining themselves as independents. It's just really, really hard to kind of run up the middle and get 35% of the vote. Just look at Kyrsten Sinema in Arizona, which, by the way, is one of the states that has the most independents, most swing voters in the country. And she may run, and we may get to see this kind of independent test in action in that state in the Senate race. But all the polls show her still in third place as the incumbent senator, kind of at 15, 20%, making a, big statement. But, you have to get 35, 40% to really, Ross Perot was at that level back in 92. That was the high water mark in my time. It's just really hard. And I do think that when you look at the polling out there, Trump if it's Trump, he still has control of about 80% of the Republican Party, and getting 20% of Republicans, anti-Trump Republicans, and getting maybe 15% of anti-Biden Democrats. It's just going to be really hard to put together a plurality, and add to the fact that Manchin or a lot of these other candidates would probably pull more from Biden than the Republican nominee, and that just is what's freaking out Democrats right now. They don't want any money. They don't want any candidates talking with no labels, because they think this is going to be a close election, and they think even a small number of votes to a third-party candidate could change the race dramatically.
Wow.
Yep. We're, what is it? Buckle your seatbelts. We're in for a bumpy night. We're in for a bumpy 15 months or so. And we're going to come back to you, Josh. I hope you don't mind. We love having you on.
Yes, I love being on, and thanks for having me for this episode.
So you asked about Joe Manchin. I thought that was really interesting. First of all, I think it's really interesting that somebody who can't get, renominated for their old job thinks they should be president of the United States. Yeah, the people of West Virginia don't like me enough, but maybe I can fool all the Americans. So, but what do you think? Do you think he has a shot?
So I don't think a third-party candidate has ever had a shot in a long time in American politics. So, but who knows if this isn't a unique year? I think you have a unique scenario in which Joe Biden is clearly the vast majority. I mean, there's so many polls showing people think he's too old for the job.
He is too old for the job.
I mean, that he's
I confirm
incompetent.
what you think, people.
If you just look at the polling, there's literally not a single issue on which he has approval of the majority of Americans on anything. Nothing. Zero. Right? And then you have, and so people do not want him to, I think a poll came out the other day, something like 70% of Americans would think it was a disaster if Joe Biden was elected to a second term, and a similar number would think it was a disaster if Donald Trump was elected. So Americans are fairly united on the fact that we're heading towards a disaster.
And yet they can't seem to stop themselves.
Well, yeah, because the primaries are run by the base, not by the overall. The swing voters don't necessarily get to vote in primaries. And so what that means is you've got an interesting dynamic going into this election, which is that both parties, there's a lot of voters who don't want their candidate but don't feel comfortable with the other candidate. And so if you're a Biden voter, if you're a Democrat or a sort of a swing voter, an independent, and you don't want to vote for Biden, you don't have any safe harbor if Trump's the nominee to go to the Republican nominee. And if you don't want to vote for Donald Trump and you're a Republican or an independent or a swing voter and you just feel you're not comfortable going there, well, I guess maybe I'll vote for Biden. No, I can't, because it's the worst president since Jimmy Carter. It's an absolute disaster. How can I vote for 4 more years of this? And so there's a lot of people who are just begging for somebody else, for safe harbor. And so there might be a scenario in which a credible third-party candidate, bipartisan, he could pick somebody
can get Joe Biden or Donald Trump elected.
Could pull enough votes from either side. Joe Manchin is a centrist, a moderate. He's
How old
established.
is he, by the way? I thought he was kind of
old,
old, too.
He's pretty old, too, yeah.
He's
but,
a sprightly 70-something.
If he picked a Republican as his running mate, so it was a bipartisan ticket, somebody like Larry Hogan or something like that, sort of centrist, moderate Republican, as his running mate, there's a lot of people who might go for that.
Just guys, we're talking about fresh young Joe Manchin. He's 75, by the way.
That's young by this field. He would be the youngest person in the field.
Yeah.
So I don't think it's likely, but I think first of all I think it's likely that if Trump is the nominee, that will happen. Because I think the No Labels movement is planning to field somebody, and so I think it's likely that it will happen. The biggest problem Joe Manchin has is that he really hurt himself by caving in on Build Back Better.
Yeah,
that's
kidding.
The reason why he can't win his Senate seat.
That's why I wouldn't vote for him.
Yeah, I mean, because he could have been the guy who stood up to Joe Biden on spending and stopped the spending spree that people are against, and stood up for fossil fuels and all the rest of it. And in West Virginia, he pissed off all the Democrats who hate him for standing up to Biden, and all the Republicans who liked him, he lost them too. So he's got, he basically alienated both sides.
Great.
I don't know how that translates nationally and whether people are pissed at him that way as well, but I don't think that it's as, normally it's like a 2% chance. I think it's somewhere above 2 to 5% chance that ticket could do something.
So last question from me to you.
Okay.
Do you think Ron DeSantis can right his ship? You wrote a very, very nice warm article about him. I know you didn't think that the Twitter rollout was as big a fiasco as I thought it was. I was actually listening to it, and when you listened to it, it was really bad.
I couldn't get into it. At the
I
time, I tried to get on, and I kept
for,
saying, this room is gone or whatever.
But I will say he seems to have a knack to make these kinds of missteps. He's got a great narrative if he could just get his shit together. Do you think he can get his shit together?
I think he can, because he got his shit together in Florida and ran an impeccable campaign there and won. He won by 19 points. He won Hispanics. He won women. He won independents decisively. He flipped Democratic counties that had been, Palm Beach County, which hadn't gone for a Republican in decades. He won. So he's shown that he can do it in Florida.
Or is he another Scott Walker?
Well, maybe. We don't know. Or maybe Donald Trump is Scott Walker or Jeb Bush or whoever it is. But, here's the case for DeSantis. I'll give you the short case for DeSantis. After the 2022 midterms, we were told that we had to choose between two types of candidates. We had to choose between the sort of reform-minded governors, forward-looking, positive reform-minded governors who are improving the lives of their citizens, and won over swing voters, independents and swing voters who don't traditionally vote for Youngkin. Kemp,
Kristi Noem,
Kemp in Georgia, DeWine, Sununu. All of these guys won in 2022 midterms decisively in those elections. The people who lost were the populist rabble-rousers who really got the conservative base excited but alienated swing voters. And so we have to choose between those two types of people. Well, maybe not, because he's both. He is a populist. He's taking on Disney. He's talking about wokeism, all those things that we talked about with Josh. It stirs the hearts of the MAGA faithful. They love that stuff. But he also has a record if you just look
as a
at
competent governor.
Not just a competent governor. His management of the hurricanes, all the bills he passed just since he came back into office since his reelection, the most forward-leaning school choice law in the country, Second Amendment rights, criminal justice reform things, for public safety. He has a raft of things that he's done. He's kind of if Mitch Daniels and Donald Trump had a baby. That's Ron DeSantis.
And on that horrifying note, folks, hope you had a great Memorial Day holiday. Thank you again to everybody who's served our country. They deserve more than just one day or 2 days. They deserve thanks every single day. And thanks for being with us.
Take care. Let us know what topics you'd like us to cover. You can get in touch with the show by emailing us at whatthehell@aei.org.
Or you can reach us on Twitter. I'm at @dpletka.
And I'm at Mark Thiessen. That's Mark with a C.
Please rate and review the podcast. If you like the show, please subscribe, share it, comment on Apple Podcasts, or wherever you're listening to this.
Thanks for listening.